Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Well, welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm happy today to be joined by Dr. Barbara Trautlein, who is the author of the best-selling book, Change Intelligence, Use the Power of CQ to Lead Change That Sticks, and the originator of the CQ system for developing change-intelligent leaders and organizations. For over 25 years, Barbara has coached executives, trained leaders at all levels, certified change agents, and facilitated mission-critical change management initiatives to achieve bottom-line business and powerful leadership results for her clients. She is very gifted at sharing strategies and tactics that are accessible, actionable, and immediately applicable, and we're going to dive into some of those today. Welcome to the program, Barbara.
Thanks so much, Charles, for having me.
Perhaps you can share a little bit of your background and really what got you interested in change intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I started my company in 1989, and just before I did, my first real job was part of a consulting team. It was back in the mid 1980s that was working in a steel mill that was in bankruptcy. So there I am, I'm 25 years old, and it's a room full. They're all men. They're all about 20 or 30 or 40 years older than me, and pretty much to a man, they worked in that mill their entire career. So I get up and I introduce myself. And I talk about how we're going to partner together to transform them to high performance, total quality, self-managed teams. Woohoo! And I look in the back of the room and a gentleman stands up. And he's 6'5", he's 250 pounds, he's like the Hulk. He stomps right to the middle of the room and he says, "We're steel workers and we don't listen to girls." So that was an illustrious start to my consulting career. And why do you think that gentleman did that? I always wonder what he was thinking, but especially what he was feeling. And I think he was afraid. That was the steel mill was the only game in town. It was the only job most of them knew, and it was already in bankruptcy. So I had a lot of empathy for the targets of the change. Right from that first day on the job, I had a lot of empathy for the people impacted by the change. However, I also knew right from that first day on the job that there was a heck of a lot of fear and intimidation and confusion in the change leader standing in front of the room, who was me. So that's what got me down my now over 30-year path to equip and empower my fellow change leaders. And I believe everyone listening right now to this podcast is in that category, a fellow change leader, just like me and you, Charles. There's way too much going on at workplaces in our world to be leaves blowing in the wind. We all need to look at ourselves as change agents driving change.
I've seen that happen personally, professionally. I've seen it with other organizations. But I'd love to ask the question, why do you think most change projects fail?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I believe that we have hundreds, if not thousands, of models and methods and tools to manage change. And it's not that they're wrong. I think they're really, really important. All the spreadsheets and the processes, the stakeholders for communications for training, they're not wrong, but I think they're incomplete. They're baseline. I think that's what's missing is not just managing change, but actually leading change. I'm an organizational psychologist by nature. And so I know that what happens when neuroscientists place electrodes on people's brains and introduce them to a change, the same neuroreceptors fire when we get introduced to change as when we feel physical pain. Isn't that fascinating? So literally to our brains, change equals pain. So I knew that we needed a new way to help ourselves and others through these very challenging transitions.
So true, and and you're right that change really equates with many people to pain, that they have to feel that they have to change a process because there's always these switching costs, these change costs that people don't realize, and that's probably one of the big reasons, like you said, why a lot of these change projects fail. And then when they do happen, a lot of times they fail to stick and deliver meaningful results, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so the other thing to think about is that what happens when our brain is in pain? What happens when that fear threat response gets evoked? Well, what happens is that all the good stuff that feeds our brain, the oxygen, the glucose, gets sucked down past our neck. So we can do what? We can fight, we can flight, we can freeze, or I recently heard we can faint. A lot of F's go on, right? From our brain to our body. And so, what all those reactions have in common is that change literally makes us less smart. Just when we need all our cognitive capabilities to think clearly and creatively, to invent new solutions, to pivot, to innovate, we literally get blinders on. We go to a well learned, dominant, habituated patterns, behaviors that made us successful in the past, and we don't even do those well. That's our brain on change. So that's why, again, we often come up with these substandard solutions, and therefore change doesn't stick.
And it sounds like you're really getting at the point where it's about the people, right? Not the process that can make or break the ability to successfully carry out a change project.
Absolutely. So often that the other implication of the neuroscience of change is that it helps normalize resistance. The number one topic in the change literature is overcoming resistance to change. So we start off with the best intentions. We know that these changes that we need to make, while they might be painful, are really important for the success or survivability of our organizations. And that reaction that we get, that fear threat reaction, is actually normal and natural. It's why we survive as individuals and why we've thrived as a species. So that reaction is normal and natural. So it helps again normalize resistance. It's not a sign that we're doing anything wrong as change leaders. So it gives us the opportunity. I think it can seem like a bad news story, right? This brain on change, this fear threat reaction. I think for us as change leaders is actually a good news story because it helps shows us that we're not doing anything wrong when we get that resistance. Resistance is normal and natural. So the opportunity as change leaders, and again, we're all change leaders regardless of tenure, title, or role, the opportunity is not to try to overcome it or prevent it or eradicate it, which I think is exhausting for us as change leaders and probably insulting for the people who are trying to lead through change. Instead, we can reframe resistance from our enemy to ally. We can actually use resistance as a powerful source of information to change the only thing we can, which is what? Ourselves. Not our personalities. Nobody needs a personality transplant, but our mindsets and especially our behaviors so we can engage in change.
And that perspective shift is really critical, and it is really a paradigm shift in terms of realizing that you have the power to control it, and it's that resistance that you can use to move yourself forward through whatever change initiative you're undergoing, whether at work or personally. So there's a lot of stuff in this space in change management, and you've identified and have this great resource, this tool, this framework around change intelligence. Explain to our listeners how that's really different CQ from maybe IQ or EQ.
Exactly. Well, as I say, in the stress of change, when our IQ goes down, when we literally get less smart, I say CQ to the rescue. So it's all about CQ helps us put our oxygen mask on first. It reminds us to breathe, to separate that knee jerk, autonomic, unconscious reaction from a more leaderly, adaptive response. Because remember, we have options when we lead ourselves and others through change. And the more options we have, the more power we have. So it's another intelligence, just like IQ, emotional intelligence, or EQ, emotional intelligence, right? It's another intelligence. And I think that one of the neat thing is to, just think about, as we know, for example, from emotional intelligence is ABC. Become aware that this is happening in our brain and our body. First step is awareness. Then B is breathe, breathe. Separate that, again, autonomic reaction from a wiser response, and C, choose your response. And that's one thing change intelligence helps us do, because we're aware that we have options. So change intelligence, actually, the definition of it is just that. It's the awareness of our style of leading change, and then it's the ability to adapt our style to be optimally effective across people and situations.
Well, and that's great to know, because with change, that is something that you can change and get better at, like a skill. Because some people believe with IQ, it's either you have it or you don't, and there's a limited amount of influence you have over that. But with your change intelligence, it's something that you can improve over time, but it does require a diligent effort, correct?
Absolutely. So it's, takes the will to build a skill, right? And so, absolutely. So it's very consistent with the growth mindset, right? That I look at any change challenge that we experience as both an opportunity to solve the problem of the day, as well as an opportunity to build individual, team, and organizational enterprise-wide change capability for the future. So absolutely, I think it's both and the more experience we have with change, the more that we can build these behaviors that we can learn to incorporate different options, different choices into our behavioral repertoire as a leader. And again, that helps us recognize that just the growth mindset, that instead of being stopped, fear, afraid, we recognize we can point to progress. We recognize the successes that we've had, and we can pay that forward into the future. We can actually not have a fixed mindset, but a growth mindset about our ability to lead ourselves and others through change.
That's wonderful. And that's so critical when leading any kind of change initiative or being a part of it. Now, your model really separates people into three different change types. And so, what is it important for leaders to know on how to engage the heart, enlighten the head, and equip the hands, which are the three types of maybe default behaviors or categories of change leaders?
Yeah, so absolutely. So what I distinguished over the first 20 years of my career when I was helping lead change in bankrupt steel mills to startup steel mills to IT implementations to merger and acquisitions, all kinds of changes, is that there are three primary styles of leading change. That just like any change itself needs an effective purpose, an efficient process, and engaged people, any of us as change leaders need to engage hearts, enlighten heads, and equip hands so we can all move forward together and lead successful and sustainable change. So that's right. So I have an assessment that helps people understand how their tendencies to lead in each of these ways. And just like we each have a heart and a head, and most of us have two hands, we can engage in each of those behaviors. And we have evidence when we do. It's just we tend to have a preference.
Is there a preferred one out of those three?
Yes, absolutely. So we do have a preference, and some of us are. There's actually seven different styles. So some of us are stronger on one, some on a combination, some kind of moderate on all three. But all those three styles do have strengths, and they do have potential struggles. So yes, that's what the assessment helps us understand. So we can become aware of our own style, because what's the corollary of that? When we become aware of our own style, we become aware that there's other styles. We have other options. We have, in fact, all these tools in our tool bag. And so, just like you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Sometimes there's a nail in front of you, and that hammer is a very functional, adaptive tool. Sometimes you need a wrench or a micrometer or a power tool that gives us the awareness so that in the stress of change, when we are so frustrated, when our brain is on change as leaders, and we're doing everything we can, that's where people feel like we're pushing and we're forcing. We get into that kind of trying to overcome that resistance because we're trying to leverage our strengths, do the best we can in a very challenging situation. That's where building our CQ helps, because we can turn the mirror back on ourselves, right? We can recognize that, oh, that's me overdoing my strengths or neglecting my blind spots. And maybe it's those overdone strengths that are making people feel like they're being pushed and forced. So therefore they're resisting. Or maybe I'm not giving people what they need to get it. That's the head. To want it, that's the heart. Or to be able to do it, that's the hands. So maybe it's really not resistance in them, it's lack of change leadership in myself. So now I can adapt, I can adjust my approach.
Well, and your change intelligence assessment really gives everyone that understanding, right? That awareness of what change style leadership their preference is, the strengths and the weaknesses, and then areas in which they could help their team members with their strengths and weaknesses, correct?
Absolutely. So the assessment helps us understand. So, for example, if we tend to be the style who is very people oriented, like I am, that's my style. We love to engage the heart. Our normal, natural default, how we tend to be successful is we really love to focus on the people and the teams that are impacted by the change. So we're very engaging, we're communicative, we're collaborative. We love to build teams and trust. That's a strength. This is a strength-based model. All styles are strengths. However, any strength overdone, not so much a strength anymore. So what can that look like for us as high heart change leaders? And your audience can kind of self-diagnose a little bit right now. Well, that can look like sometimes we can enable in a positive sense transitions into enabling in a negative sense. And so we can maybe hesitate to challenge and confront and push people out of their comfort zone, or encourage people to push themselves out of their comfort zone. And of course, stepping out of your comfort zone, stretching yourselves is a critical part of any change initiative, and what the people who mentored us did. Also, any strength has its blind spots. Just like you're driving in a road, you're so focused on something, in this case, the people and the teams, that you have things in your blind spot that you are maybe not totally blind to, but you're downplaying, you're neglecting. And so for us high heart change leaders, that might be the goals of the change, right? Where are we going? The business objectives. The second stuff, leading change, leading from the head, they never take their eye off the prize. They love figuring out, they love looking outside their organization, the new trends, innovations, and bringing them back, right? They're very visionary, big picture, strategic. Obviously, those are strengths. How can those be overdone? Well, sometimes they're on the train is leaving the station, look around, look behind them, nobody else is on board, they've forgotten the people. Sometimes they can be charismatic, inspirational. People get on the train, but then the train derails. Why? Because they haven't helped the hands. They haven't given people the plan and the process to get from current state to future reality. And that's the gift of the third style, leading from the hands. They love to figure out how to get from here to there. They're very tactical, planful, systematic, detailed, dependable. Those are all strengths. However, how can that be overdone? Sometimes we get into analysis paralysis, right? Sometimes we have our heads down, change by checklist, we're efficient, not effective. And then sometimes they can get frustrated by those pesky people emotions or team dynamics or organizational culture considerations. So you're right. So every style has their strengths. Every style has their overdone strengths at times and their blind spots. And so that's one thing that's powerful for ourselves as individuals. And as you say, an opportunity also for us to coach our colleagues and build even more change intelligent teams collectively.
It's a very actionable framework, like you mentioned before, that allows you to take those insights and use them right away to help those change initiatives in your organization. And I love the way you do the pyramid. You've identified certain change styles that are kind of a blend of those three or a blend of two of those. So that's also helpful to know to get it a little bit more nuanced in terms of what really is your change style, what are those strengths, what are those weaknesses, and areas for development. Because I think everyone looks for that, right? And they want that approach, that development opportunity to say, where may I neglect developing in this area that's really going to hurt me down the road? And I took the assessment. I think I'm an adapter or a driver. And perhaps we can just go through maybe one or two of those just to kind of give our listeners more insights.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and you're absolutely right. And again, just stepping back for another sec, Charles, and then I'll answer that specific question. But, why did I create the CQ assessment and change intelligence in general? Because I know that on change, our brain is different. So, again, I'm an organizational psychologist. And so, for the first 20 years of my career, I used a variety of assessments to help develop people and leaders and teams. So, the DISC, the Myers Briggs, Strength Finders, etc. However, while we have assessments that help laser focus on some leadership capabilities, like Thomas Kilmann for conflict, for example, I didn't see one that really laser focused on how we lead change, right? So that's why I developed the CQ assessments. It's not to take away from any other assessment, it's to supplement, augment, complement, right? So I actively use those still. And when my clients are in critical mode of leading change, this is something that, which we all are, this is something that really helps in that use case. So to your point about, that's right, we're all blends of styles, and you could picture it on a triangle, which in fact is the Greek symbol delta for change, which is fun. But you mentioned the heart and the head. So that's my style, the champion style. So champions like myself, we get where the change needs to go, and we enjoy motivating and rallying the people to get there. So that's the head and the heart together. So we like to champion change. So obviously that's a strength. We need to get people on board. We need to engage people, enthuse them, right? Be optimistic about the change possibilities. However, two things about our style. One is that the opposite side of the triangle from our style. So in my case, the hands is two things. It's one, it's the style that in the stress of change, when when we have our blinders on and our IQ is going down, it's what we tend to drop out the most. So that right there is actionable information that, I love the expression, every master was once a disaster. You teach what you need to learn. So I definitely had instances early in my career when I would show up to one of my steel mills on a, Monday morning, and nothing would have happened. Because why? Because people were inspired, they were engaged, right? They got the big picture, but they didn't know specifically tactically what to do, right? To get from here to there, right? We hadn't really nailed that plan. So that's one thing, that's our individual gap and blind spot. The second thing, though, is that it's also the style of people that we tend to frustrate the most when we're attempting to partner with them, because what's important to us in leading change is diametrically opposed to what's important to them. So, for example, my positive intent as a change leader is to champion the change. My negative impact on my opposite style, my high hand executor friends, can be that I'm not a champion, I'm a cheerleader. And when it's really bad, they can perceive me not as motivating, which is always my positive intent, but actually manipulating. So that's one of the key things, too. It can really help us give and receive feedback on our teams much less defensively because we have that empathy for each other, that we understand that, oh, they're trying to do the right thing. And yet, this is how it's landing on me. So we can more actively give, constructive feedback, right? Instead of being frustrated with each other. And we can also then understand how to adapt our approach so that, again, I'm not just unintentionally communicating with my colleagues in the exciting what and the why of the change. I'm also communicating the how. How do we get from here to there? So that's why that's very important. Now, for your style, if you are, and I believe you are the adapter, Charles, right in the middle of the triangle, right? So you're mid range on head, heart, hands, which is an awesome style because folks like you, they intuitively gets what's missing in a change, right? And if there's lack of engagement, you can jump in and you can have a town hall meeting or walk the floor, talk to people one on one, right? You can bring the people together, hear their needs and concerns and address them. If people are working really hard, but their efforts are off target, you can enlighten the head, right? You can lift people's heads up, show them the line of sight between what you're asking them to do and why it matters, like paint that picture of the future. And if people are paralyzed during the headlights, they're just not in action, you can help the hands, right? Maybe they had training, but they need coaching. Maybe there's some barrier standing in the way of good people, behaving consistently with change. So you can intuitively do that. Now, the adapter doesn't have an opposite side on the triangle. So some people say, is the point to become an adapter? No. The definition of change intelligence is awareness of your style and the ability to adapt it. So adapters have potential struggles too, one of which is sometimes too adaptable. So you can come off as kind of chameleon like to other people, kind of pivoting too much, being too almost change friendly. And in the worst cases, sometimes that could even create trust issues because what is trust but demonstrated action over time? So that's just one example of how that, again, any strength is a strength, but it can be overdone or we can neglect other critical aspects of the change that really help people, again, be able to get it, want it, and be able to do it.
Thank you. Those are some great insights on two of the many change styles you have as part of this framework. Want to kind of understand, or perhaps you can give me some insight into any intriguing results that you found, because this is a huge assessment database. You've been collecting this for many years. And have you found any differences in leading change across different hierarchical levels or in different cultures or regions of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's some of the most interesting results is being able to now, a decade after we had the 10-year anniversary this year of Change Intelligence. So it's very excited. We have tens of thousands of folks in the database at all different levels. So since you asked about levels, that is some of the most interesting actionable results is that what we tend to see is that there are some consistent differences by level. And so not surprisingly, probably folks at the top of organizations, senior leaders, they tend to lead somewhat more from the head, the vision, the strategy. I don't want your audience to hear that if they're not by nature a high head change leader, that they should not aspire to senior ranks, because I think that's one of the critical failure factors in leading change is that we don't have all styles represented at different levels. And we really need that. We need all those different perspectives because any change needs a purpose, process, and people. But anyway, we tend to see more of that at the senior ranks, which is logical. That's their role, that's their job, steering towards new horizons. However, what's the implication of that? Well, the higher up you go, the harder it is to get any feedback at all, let alone real time and actionable feedback. So they're the most bought into the need for the change because they see the big picture, they see the external environment. However, they tend to be blind to often not as aware of the impact of changes throughout the organization. As I always say, what you see depends on where you sit, and change looks very different at different levels of the hierarchy, very different in the C suite versus on the factory floor, right? So, frontline leaders tend to be supervisors, etc., they tend to be higher heart. You would think maybe hands, execution, that's where execution happens, but that's one way the CQ assessment is different than other assessments in that, because what happens on the front line is that's where what is changed, one person changing their behavior at a time. So that's where communication occurs, engagement occurs, translating the message occurs. And so the folks on the front line can seem the most resistant because they have to change their behaviors the most to make the change come to life. And they often are the last to know, haven't had the soak time to think about it. What are the implications for the people? Feel like my needs and concerns haven't been addressed. The folks in the middle, who's a lot, I think, the IMS audience, tend to be more balanced head, heart, hands. However, lead slightly more from the hands, I think, because they're juggling multiple accountabilities. They're really expected to make things happen, get things done, right? So there's really some very interest, but they're squeezed, they're like the bologna in the sandwich, right? They get the edicts from above, which they might not fully understand or buy into. They get the pushback from below, which sometimes they don't feel equipped to really effectively address. And it's a very challenging position to be in. So what we say, what I've seen in my clients, the most change intelligent organizations, they have different ways where they communicate down. They communicate down not just what is the vision, the strategy, the big picture, the what and the why the change, but they communicate about the who and the how. We have change intelligent communications planning, storytelling tools, which really enable organizations to customize a story to address the needs of the concerns and different stakeholders. So we don't just have that reactive buy-in, which is another very typical topic in the change literature, is how do we get them to buy in, again, doing something to or in spite of or against. Instead of, it enables us then to encourage proactive building because people own what they help create. And so also what change intelligence organizations do is they give feedback up in new and different ways. So what you see depends on where you sit, right? So the ability to both have the leaders at all levels be able to solicit that feedback, show the vulnerability to want to receive it, show that they're listening, that they're doing something to it, and for the people to have the skills and the courage to give that feedback. Because so often, just asking a question can come off as resistance. Just asking a question, and just like the leaders maybe haven't, formal leaders haven't had a lot of or any skill or training in how to lead change, people on the front lines or throughout the organization have not had training on how to get their voice heard in a way that it can be heard. Yeah, I always say that behind any complaint is a request, and people complain before they commit. And so often people's feedback, input, even questions can come off like resistance. How do we encourage people, train people, coach people, role model for people in a way that they can get their voice heard, not as a complainer or a resistor, but a positive project contributor?
How about for regions of the world, different countries, different cultures? Have you seen any changes with the results?
Yeah, so we're more alike than we're different around the world. I think that's kind of edifying. It's very consistent with the results on organizational culture surveys, for example, like the work by Dan Dennis and his team, Human Synergistics, a lot of different culture organizations. When they look at it, it's really more organizational culture that we see some differences in, as opposed to necessarily regional culture. There are some maybe suggestive differences, but not statistically significant. Like here in North America, we lead a little more from the head, as you might imagine, right? More capitalistic, for profit. In Europe, there's a little more heart that we see, in Africa as well. And in Japan and Asian countries in general, a little more from the hands, right? So we see a little suggestive differences, but nothing that's statistically significant.
Well, that's interesting to know. So we've talked a lot about individual change leaders. Let's talk a little bit about teams and organizations. How can teams use this information?
Yeah, so in addition to an individual profile that you get from completing your report, you can create a team profile. And what we see a lot of times is that when a team sees their collective profile, there's sort of a collective aha. Now we see a picture paints a thousand words, because it gives them a simple but powerful common language to be able to give and receive feedback, again, much less defensively, and understand the root cause of some of the dynamics. They can immediately see why they're successful in some ways and synergistic in some ways, and why they might struggle. Because in your team profile, you could see if you're rather balanced across head, heart, hands, if you have, kind of a bifurcated team that might have some issues, or you have an outlier and maybe we're not really listening and embracing that perspective. So it's both insightful, you can do an analysis, but also, to your point, it's actionable because there's things you can do about it. Because it's not always possible, for example, to add people to your team just based on your CQ style, right? A lot of times we have change teams or executive teams or department teams based on people's experience and their skill, right? So it's not just about adding people, it's also about encouraging the people on our team to flex, to leverage different aspects of their own skill. And also, it's about other things. So, for example, if we know we have a gap, we can build muscle through training and coaching in areas where we go we don't enjoy. Or we can, as I say, put systems and structures in place to keep things on our radar screen that we might drop out. If we have a naturally lower heart team, what can we do? Well, we can bake into our agendas things like periodic pulse surveys or engagement surveys or town hall meetings or one on ones, right? So we keep the people and the teams and the culture on our radar screen.
Now let's move to organizations. Companies taking on major transformations. How might they use this framework?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what clients tell me time and time again is that, really taking on building their individual and collective change intelligence, it gives them this common language. That's probably the most common thing that I hear. So it gives them, as I say, an enabling foundation to lead not just through the change of the day, but all changes to come. So I always think of, looking at any change challenge as a pop up learning lab that we can do both. And what clients are telling me more and more, especially in the last several years since the pandemic and social justice issues, is that it also fosters a culture that's more inclusive, more open and embracing of diversity, fostering belonging, and really creating psychological safety. Because psychological safety, as we know, is the number one factor of high performance teams, and I think also a critical success and failure factor in change. Because again, if what we see depends on where we sit, so often people at different levels and different groups of the hierarchy see landmines, they see roadblocks, see things that could go wrong. But if they don't feel safe to get their voice heard, if they feel like there's going to be repercussions or vilified or ostracized, they're not going to do it. And this enables people again to get their voices heard because we know how to make our positive intent match our impact. And that's the case if we're, again, the individual contributor, or we're the one giving the feedback, but also the one listening to the feedback, the one hearing the feedback, reframing that resistance from enemy to ally, and actively looking at surfacing it, honoring it, exploring it, not trying to prevent or eradicate or eliminate it. And there's case studies on my website to this effect. For example, just leading through the pandemic, organizations that took this on, building this capability before the pandemic, examples of leading through it in a way that they emerge stronger, both culturally and financially, from having taken that on.
That's great insight that organizations is equally applicable to them, and it really causes everyone to have that common language. So before we end this episode, I always like to end with a call to action. What is one thing that you think every leader can do today to develop their CQ?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I just always say that just like Gandhi said, be the change you wish to see. As a psychologist, I know that change starts with us. So look at ourselves. Look at ourselves. And again, of course, you're always, free to go to my website and download the tools and read the first couple chapters of my book and get more of a sense of your own CQ, even take the assessment. And right now, what you can do today is you can observe the people that you're leading through change. And you can see what have you previously thought of as resistance, difficult, challenging behaviors. Now, how can you reframe that in your own mind from enemy to ally? And how can you see that, that complaint is really a request? And there is something that I can do now that I've gone through ABC. I'm aware of this dynamic. I can breathe and I can make a different choice. So I can again bring another tool from my tool bag and see how have I been kind of overdoing some of my strengths, which is causing, pushing, which is causing them to push back, causing that resistance. Or is there something that they really need from me, right? So that they can get it more easily. They really understand the change and they see themselves in the change, the line of sight between what we're asking them to do and why it matters, right? And their contribution. Is it because they don't really want it? Is there some fear, concern, sense of loss that I haven't been addressing? Or sometimes what looks like resistance is that people just haven't been asked for their opinion, or they haven't been given the soak time, this SOAK. How does this impact me, right? Or how does this impact the process? And that's the last thing. Again, maybe people get it, want it, but they just can't do it, right? They need more training, they need different tools, they need coaching. Again, there's some barriers in the way, they need more resources, and maybe that's the gap. So again, observe the people you're leading through change and see that what that's telling you, right, in terms of opportunities for you to forge even more effective partnerships and change.
Great advice. Thank you so much for joining me today. And just remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work. You kind of reference your website, but
Yeah, thank you so much. It's Change Catalysts with an S, changecatalyst.com. And I'm very accessible via LinkedIn also.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.